you.
Can you see me as well?
I can't see you at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean
I can, so I think we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so long as people can, and so long as people can hear you, that's absolutely fine. Do you have slides to share with us?
I do, yeah.
Fine. Do go ahead
Well, good
and
luck.
see if you can share them.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Great, thanks very much.
Excellent. Over to you, Dan. I'll go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. So, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to listen to all these talks today. They've been great. I've really enjoyed the conference so far. Today, I suppose I'm going to give a slightly different perspective, and I'm going to explore the impact of bereavement on staff who have experienced drug-related deaths within their caseload. So, I'm a PhD student studying drug-related bereavement in Ireland at the moment, and I have done some work on families, which I will go into in a minute, but my current study at the moment examines the impact on staff, and I suppose anyone like myself who has spent any amount of time working in addiction, hopefully some of this work will resonate with you and will be of some value going forward as well. So I suppose just to give an overview of what I mean by drug-related deaths in the context of my presentation here, I'm referring to deaths that are directly associated with the intake of substances that are classified as opioids. But these deaths are linked to drug use, where the death can also be a cause of medical complications or violence, accident or infectious disease as well. At home here in Ireland, there is the National Drug-Related Death Index, which provides information about the total deaths among people who are drug and alcohol dependent in this country. From 2008 to 2017 in this country, there were 6,933 deaths recorded by the Drug-Related Death Index, and 54% of these were by poisoning, which of course means that the other 46% were by non-poisoning deaths. And this has steadily increased every year from 2008 to 2017. And while we do collect these statistics, the important thing for me was to recognize that every single one of these numbers was a person, and every single one of these people was connected to a network of family, staff, peers, friends, and otherwise. And current research in drug-related bereavement suggests that for every person deceased due to a drug-related death, there will be at least 10 individuals who are bereaved. So I guess the way I like to look at it here is you've got the circle or the cycle, and the substance dependent individual. When they're taken out of that equation, you have a very wide range of people who are affected by the death. And that's something that I really seek to explore in my research as I'm going forward on my PhD. A lot of drug-related deaths tend to result in a complicated grief, and I'll be referring to that as I go on in my presentation. So I suppose just to provide a definition, drug-related deaths are abrupt losses by non-natural causes, and they are often loaded with social and moral stigmas. I guess drug-related deaths tend to challenge societal values in a way that other deaths, whether it be by accident or natural causes, don't. And complicated grief can often occur against a cultural backdrop that may criminalise the drug user or their family in the aftermath of a death. So a recently published paper by myself and my colleague, Dr. Sharon Lambert, we examined families who are living with bereavement by drug and related death in this country. So the paper explored the impact of complicated grief on the family system. So what we did was we interviewed multiple members of the same family together, and we explored the impact of the death on family dynamics and how the relationships were navigated or negotiated in the aftermath as well. Much of the current literature on drug-related bereavement in families, I suppose it explores the impact of stigma and how the death is processed in the aftermath. And of course, there is a very long, in many cases, there is a very long, complicated grief process attached to that. In our study, there were three core themes that emerged: the renegotiation of relationships, experiencing complex emotions, and adjusting to a new reality. And oftentimes, family dynamics were completely altered in the aftermath of the death. The findings demonstrated that the population experienced great difficulty in processing their grief as they struggled with stigma, family breakdown, and navigating supports. But something that I suppose was a recurring theme in this paper as well in many of the interviews was interactions with staff and service providers, which inspired my current study now as well. So I wanted to examine, I guess, as wide a spread as I could, given the fact that anyone who is experiencing addiction will navigate a range of services, whether it be justice, the justice system, social services, family support, anything like that. So in my study, I included general practitioners, doctors, project workers and managers, addiction counsellors, and paramedics and emergency medical staff as well. And I guess one of the key I suppose a key quote that emerged from my findings in this study was that these deaths are frustrating. It comes back to the thought that some of these people were so young, some older, but they're all, in this participant's mind, preventable deaths. So, as anyone who would have worked in, I guess, in any level of addiction and has interaction with clients, exposure to death in the workplace has well-documented health and practice implications for staff in areas of homelessness, addiction, and medicine. And that was something I really wanted to cover in this study. My own experience, I guess, is limited to working in addiction services. And I was also, I suppose, very cognizant of the fact that people experiencing addiction will engage with homelessness services, medical services or otherwise. To date, little empirical research has examined trauma responses specifically linked to drug-related bereavement in staff. So this image here kind of, I guess, marks some of the internal conflicts that may emerge in the aftermath of a death. So when it's responding to a death, is it emotional? Do we follow procedure? Do we mark the death in a personal way, or should we go the formal route, I suppose, encouraged by whatever organisation we may be in at the time? Service provider wellbeing has been studied extensively in other areas such as homelessness and long-term care of patients near the end of life. The deaths of elderly patients have generally normative healing trajectories. In contrast, a death by suicide requires targeted support pathways to address the sudden and traumatic nature of the death. And one of the key studies that informed my current study was a study by my colleague in Forsyth in 2011, which did examine quantitatively the impact of drug-related deaths on staff that experienced death as part of their caseload, and they discovered that grief-related reactions such as self-blame and anxiety and different things like that were evident in 90% of their sample. On my study, I conducted 15 semi-structured interviews with individuals working in a range of support roles, and I used reflexive thematic analysis to analyse the findings. Another quote that emerged that I thought was quite pertinent was it's the loss of potential. It's the fact that they never got to resolve some of the things that brought them to this life in the first place. So the results, 4 key themes emerged, which I'll explore and show some extracts from them as I'm going forward. But I think it's very important for me as well to mention the relationship with service users that emerge in the data. In many settings, a relationship building process between service provider and service user developed. And this participant 6 stated that sometimes you see more of these clients you work with than you do of your own family. Sometimes you know this person so well you have more of an understanding where their ACEs and their trauma came from. And other participants then, who had been working in places such as residential settings or otherwise, had developed deep professional and working relationships with their clients. And one of the reactions to a client death from participant 9 was that there was an awful lot of emotion that came up for her in that death, the type of emotion that you would only identify with if it was someone of your own family. And I think that's very important to recognise as well, that while as service providers we tend to follow procedure and protocol, it's also very important to recognise that there can be impacts from the death and different levels of processing depending on the relationship and everything associated with it. So the first theme, guilt and self-blame. Drug-related deaths were often manifested feelings of guilt and self-blame in the initial stages of the grief process. There's an unbelievable guilt. I always feel it's my fault if one of my patients die, as you always feel it's such a shame and so unnecessary and so unfair and potentially preventable. And that's something that was recurring in the data as well, the word preventable, the word unnecessary. And I really do hope to, I suppose, get that message across in the work as well. Self-questioning was also a recurring grief-related reaction, as detailed by one general practitioner. Did I miss something? Did I give the wrong dose? Should I have asked different questions? Could we have averted this in another way, in a medical point of view, a legal point of view? In some cases then, the feelings of guilt go unprocessed, as service providers retain vivid collections of traumatic events in which they were responding to overdose. So this participant 7, I was very grateful for the conversation. I've started to recognize that I have stuff that's unprocessed from my experiences. I can see her face, I can see the mucus, I can see the sound of her falling. And then I carried a lot of guilt because there's always that thing, very commonly associated with any sudden death. If I'd gone up 3 minutes earlier and called the ambulance, might she still be alive? And that was something, again, that many of the participants in this study, I was very grateful to get their experiences and they shared them with me. And I guess as I carried out this this study during the pandemic as well, there was a lot of increased feelings of guilt and self-blame, given the fact that a lot of service providers felt they lost control over certain areas of their job because of new restrictions and shifts in priorities, etc., redeployments in different roles as well. The second theme, traumatic shock.
Five more minutes, Daniel.
Thanks, Jim. This participant said, I've had real traumatic shock where I needed the support of my colleagues. One client had a benzo detox, vulnerable young man, went to residential treatment and lasted 3 weeks and said he wasn't staying there any longer after working very hard to get this person in there. And I guess another thing that did occur or did recur in the data was the effort and the investment that a lot of service providers had in the recovery of their clients. All the promises, you were invested in their recovery. And then I got a call on a Monday to say he had overdosed on heroin, which was not his drug of choice. And this participant's grief-related reactions associated with this death was, I found myself being pissed off with him for all the promises. And then I thought he was trying not to let me down, trying to make me proud by staying off the benzos, and probably went to try and get painkillers. And then someone offered him heroin. It ended up he actually had pneumonia and he didn't know. So this is very traumatic for anyone who may have worked with someone who's had a similar experience such as this. And again, very grateful to this particular participant for sharing their experience. The impact of stigma, which was, I guess, a huge theme in my paper, examining the impact on families, but it was very interesting to find that stigma also affected service providers in a very unique way. One of the most stigmatizing places for people who are substance dependent are healthcare services. In my line of work, I spend a lot of time actually trying to convince people to give health services a second chance. And this participant was very adamant about the fact that they weren't sure if they had ever tried hard enough to get them to come back. And while it may not be within their control to do so, there was still a guilt attached to this. Participants noted that closure is important for them, but sometimes there's uncertainty about how to approach this due to stigma. It's not the most straightforward thing. It's not like the sudden death of a person who dies of a heart attack. You have that whole stigma around drug use, so you do internalize that a bit. Can I go and tell someone as a professional that I'm impacted personally that someone who has injected heroin has died suddenly? Is it appropriate for us to go to his funeral? We've been working with this person a long time. His family may not want that part of his life represented. I don't know how people navigate it. And this comes back to the interaction between families and staff as well. And that was something that did recur quite a lot. The shame and stigma is very much alive. When a family lose someone to substance use and they organise the funeral, they may put someone's address on rip.ie as the home address, which is the death notification website here in Ireland. They won't state that this person lived in a hostel or centre, and they'll say the funeral is private. Families will sometimes withhold funeral details or send a message to say staff aren't welcome. It's a complex area. That being said, it's also very important for me to notice that there were very positive interactions with families as well, where the funeral was, obviously within COVID, there were restrictions on numbers, but there were incidents as well where the families did recognise the importance of the community that the deceased was a part of while they were alive. So the final theme then, closure and recovery. Participant 7 stated that one of the features of trauma is that people get this inability to grieve. And if you don't recognise the huge loss of life when a person dies in a service, are you feeding further into that idea that everyone just needs to get on with it and not be sad? Are we saying it's an acceptable part of life and we don't even notice it? And if not, then what's it doing to us, to our hearts, to our respect for life, or our compassion for people, or our hope for their potential? Speaking specifically to clients here. It is okay to say I am disconnecting from this in order to sustain my capacity to work with people who are in such crisis all the time. But if that's not done in a planned, measured way, then people do it in a negative, unplanned way, which turns into compassion fatigue. So I guess this participant was communicating the fact that it is hugely important to recognise grief-related reactions, both in yourself, your colleagues, and manage them accordingly. We all work in our ethics, we all work in our boundaries, so nothing inappropriate happens in services. But this lady, who had passed away sadly just prior to an interview, was really, really unique. I've never met anyone like her. I was very, very lucky to be her person. It was a very privileged position, and I think that's a privilege that has brought me to where I am in my career. And this very much resonated with me as well. When you're working with people in any capacity, it is very much a privilege to be able to support them. So if we're not improving how we deal with it and how we help everyone else around us, that means we're ignoring it, and it's Pandora's box, and we just don't open it. And I think that's how the service is functioning on that right now. So thank you very much for listening to me, and that's the end of my talk. I've included some references that inform my study as well here. But thanks very much, everyone, for listening.
Good, thank you very much, Daniel, and you've kept beautifully to time, and also a very beautifully presented talk. I would say,
Thanks very much.
Use of slides and all very, very clear. Thank you very much for that. There's one question here already from Teresa Collins, who asks, did you find that any of the participants had developed maladaptive coping? And she refers specifically to something she calls dark humor that apparently emergency medical workers have often been found to use to deal with the traumatic events that they see regularly. Did you find anything like that, or any other particular coping strategies that people?
Yes, and thanks very much for the question. I appreciate it. There was, while not entirely prevalent across all interviews, there was, I guess, conversations around desensitization and how that's approached in the workplace. There was conversations about how, when a death reaches past a certain point of time, maybe a couple of years, when reflecting on fond memories and different things like that, I suppose staff did tend to speak about how they would joke about certain things then, but the dark humor was also something that kind of came up in quite a few conversations, where one participant in particular kind of took a step back from it and questioned, and there was quite a bit of self-questioning during interviews as well, which was very interesting. But this particular participant questioned whether the dark humor or the jokes was their way of, I guess, coping with it, in the sense that, just recognizing that it affected them, but not perhaps in a maladaptive way, or not the most planned way, trying to process it through that. Does that answer your question?
Sounds as if it, yeah, sounds as if we go a long way to answer. Yes, thank you. I've got another question to come up here. Mr. I don't know if it's Mr. Ed or Mr. ED, I'm not sure. But anyway, someone here says, a moving and much needed area of research. Do you find the organization's culture tends to have blaming aspects regarding serious adverse incidents, and that adds to the strain of the workers? So people blame themselves perhaps for things that have gone wrong or tended. But what about the culture? Do some of the cultures add to that?
There was quite a difference between people who were working in different levels of organization, whether it was more private healthcare or otherwise. Excuse me. But I guess some of the participants might have felt targeted in a way, in the sense that there was stories about some colleagues ending up in court following the investigation or otherwise. It wasn't really something that was totally prominent. I guess in one way, some participants didn't feel supported by the organisation, but then they questioned whether it was something that was even recognised, not through ignorance, but perhaps through a lack of understanding, or a lack of understanding of the need to process it. And if certain staff members aren't recognising it, then perhaps it wasn't brought to the attention of the correct people in the organisation as well. So there wasn't anything specifically concrete about that, but there was a sense of, I suppose, not a culture, but the facilitation of blame, given, I suppose, adverse experiences that might happen in the aftermath of a death. And that was often exacerbated by negative reactions with people that may have been family members or otherwise.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Dan. I think we're probably going to have to pass on, because, as you know, time's so short. But I'm getting a lot of messages here on the chat thanking you.